There is a version of the First World War that most people have absorbed without realizing it. It lives in the image of men standing at attention in sepia photographs, in the phrase, "the war to end all wars," in the idea that those who fought were brave, and those who sent them were, at worst, misguided. It is a version scrubbed clean of smell, scrubbed clean of the particular texture of mud that was not simply dirt, but a compound of earth and water and human remains that had been churned by artillery shells until it had become something new, something the men who moved through it could never fully describe to anyone who had not also moved through it. The version most people carry is a story about sacrifice and loss, framed in the language of nobility, wrapped in the quiet assurance that the suffering meant something. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. What follows is not the story of heroism. It is the story of normalization. It is the account of how an industrialized civilization organized the destruction of its own young men, with the same administrative precision it applied to railway timetables and factory output, and how the men who survived and the institutions that persisted quietly absorbed that experience into everyday behavior, everyday language, everyday thought, until the machinery of mass death had left its mark not just on battlefields, but on the entire structure of how people in the 20th century understood bodies, pain, bureaucracy, authority, and the acceptable cost of a human life. The war began in the summer of 1914 with a mobilization that was, from a purely logistical standpoint, astonishing. Within weeks of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the major European powers had activated systems that had been in preparation for decades. Millions of men were called up, organized, transported, equipped, and moved toward front lines with a speed and scale that had no precedent in human history. The German army mobilized over 3 million men in the first weeks alone. France mobilized over 4 million. Britain, which initially relied on volunteers rather than conscripts, saw hundreds of thousands of men queue outside recruitment offices in the first months of the war, driven by a combination of genuine patriotism, social pressure, and a widespread belief that the conflict would be short. Nobody on any side had genuinely prepared for what it would become. The generals had studied previous wars. They had studied the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which had lasted months. They had studied colonial campaigns in Africa and Asia, which had been managed with relative efficiency against enemies far less organized and far less armed than the forces now facing each other across Europe. They had not adequately studied the American Civil War, which had demonstrated decades earlier what industrialized weaponry could do to massed infantry formations. And so when the armies of Europe met each other in 1914, they brought with them tactical assumptions that belonged to a different era, and the result was a collision between 19th century military doctrine and 20th century killing technology that produced casualties on a scale that the administrative systems of all the involved nations were simply not designed to process. The first disturbing practice that became normal was the treatment of death as a statistical category rather than an individual event. In wars before the industrial age, when armies were smaller and engagements were more geographically contained, it was at least theoretically possible to identify the dead, to notify families, to maintain some record of where a man had fallen and where he had been buried. The First World War broke this in the first weeks and never repaired it. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties in a single day, including roughly 20,000 dead. The logistical challenge of identifying, recording and notifying next of kin for those numbers in that time frame was simply beyond what the available systems could manage. What emerged instead was a bureaucratic infrastructure designed not to process individual deaths, but to manage the administrative fact of disappearance. Men were listed as missing. They were listed as killed in action, with no grave known. They were entered into ledgers. Families received telegrams that said nothing about the circumstances, nothing about what had actually happened in the final moments. because in many cases nobody knew and nobody had the time or the resources to find out. The military bureaucracies of all the involved nations developed standardized language for this. Language that acknowledged the death while draining it of any particular human content. The notification telegram was not a document designed to help a family understand what had happened to their son or husband or father. It was a document designed to discharge an administrative obligation while conveying the minimum possible information. This was not callousness in the personal sense. The officers who signed those forms were often themselves exhausted, often themselves aware that they might be next. It was something more systemic. It was the application of industrial logic to human loss. You could not process 20,000 deaths as 20,000 individual tragedies and continue to function as an institution. So you processed them as numbers, and the numbers went into files, and the files went into archives, and the individual human beings behind the numbers were left to their families to grieve in whatever way their families could manage, with whatever information they had been given, which was almost never enough. The second practice that became normalized was the systematic suppression of accurate casualty information from the civilian population. Every government involved in the war imposed censorship on the press from the earliest weeks. Britain created the Press Bureau. France had the Service de la Presse. Germany had its own military censorship apparatus. The stated rationale was military security, the need to prevent information about troop movements or tactical positions from reaching the enemy. This was not entirely without basis, but the censorship extended well beyond anything that could be justified by military necessity. Newspapers were prohibited from publishing photographs of the wounded that showed the true nature of battlefield injuries. They were prohibited from reporting on the actual rates of psychiatric collapse. They were prohibited from describing conditions in the trenches in language that deviated from the approved narrative of disciplined soldiers holding firm against the enemy. What the civilian populations of Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia received through their newspapers was a version of the war that bore a carefully managed relationship to the war that was actually occurring. Men were reported as falling bravely. Ground was reported as being taken or held. The enemy was reported as suffering far greater losses than one's own side, regardless of what the actual figures showed. The effect of this sustained, institutionalized misrepresentation was profound. It meant that for the first years of the war, the families and communities from which the soldiers came had no accurate way of understanding what was happening to the men they had sent. It meant that the social consensus that the war was being conducted honorably and effectively was maintained by active deception rather than by fact. And it created a gap between the experience of those who were in the trenches and the understanding of those who were not, that was so large and so fundamental that many veterans found it essentially impossible to bridge after the war ended. The soldiers came home having experienced something that the civilian world had been systematically prevented from comprehending, and the distance between those two realities was part of what made the post-war period, for so many men, a kind of permanent exile. The third practice was the industrialization of the wound itself. Before the First World War, the most common battlefield injuries were the result of small arms fire, artillery shells, and bladed weapons. The First World War introduced or dramatically expanded the use of weapons whose specific design was the mass production of particular categories of injury. High explosive artillery shells did not simply kill men. They dismembered them. They buried them. They transformed their bodies into fragments that were sometimes recovered and sometimes not, sometimes identified, and sometimes listed simply as remains. The shrapnel shell, which scattered hundreds of metal fragments in a wide radius on detonation, was designed to wound as well as kill, on the theory that a wounded man required more resources to manage than a dead one, and therefore imposed a greater burden on the enemy. This was not an accidental outcome. It was a design feature. The military medical services of all the involved nations were confronted almost immediately with a category of injury for which they had no adequate preparation. The volume of casualties arriving at field hospitals and casualty clearing stations in the first weeks of major offensives exceeded the capacity of those facilities by factors that made systematic treatment impossible. Surgeons who had been trained in peacetime who had performed hundreds of operations in their careers, were performing dozens of operations a day in conditions that included inadequate anesthesia, inadequate lighting, inadequate instruments, and a steady, unrelenting stream of broken human bodies that did not pause to allow any individual case the attention it might have received in a civilian hospital. The triage system that emerged from this pressure was a formalization of something that the medical staff were already doing intuitively. You sorted the wounded into those who could be saved with immediate treatment, those who could wait, and those who could not be saved regardless of what was done for them. The third category was left to die as comfortably as possible, while the medical resources were directed toward the first two. This was reasonable. It was also, in a very specific sense, a practice of institutionalized abandonment. The men placed in the third category knew, or suspected, what their placement meant. The staff who placed them there continued their work. This is not a criticism. There was no alternative that did not involve the death of men who could have been saved. But it established a practice, a habit of mind, in which the decision to allow a human being to die was made quickly, efficiently, and without the possibility of revision based on a rapid assessment of resource allocation. It was a practice that the medical and administrative systems of the war required to function, and it required the people who made those decisions to approach the death of individual human beings as a logistics problem. The fourth practice was the normalization of gas warfare. The use of poison gas as a weapon of war had been prohibited by the Hague Convention of 1899, to which most of the major belligerent powers were signatories. The German army deployed chlorine gas on a large scale at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. The initial Allied response was horror, rapidly followed by demands for retaliation in kind. Within months, the French, British, and other Allied forces were developing and deploying their own chemical weapons. By the end of the war, approximately 1.3 million chemical weapon casualties had been recorded across all sides, including roughly 90,000 deaths. What is significant about this trajectory is not simply the violation of international law, though that is significant. What is significant is the speed and completeness with which the use of a weapon specifically designed to cause prolonged, agonizing death by chemical corrosion of the respiratory system was absorbed into the normal operational planning of all the involved armies. Gas became a logistics question. How do you store it? How do you deploy it given wind conditions? How do you protect your own troops from it when the wind changes? The men who were gassed and survived were often left with permanent damage to their lungs, their eyes, their skin. Mustard gas, introduced in 1917, was particularly effective at causing injury rather than death, blistering the skin, destroying the corneas, filling the lungs with fluid. A man badly gassed with mustard gas might survive for days or weeks in extreme pain before dying, or might survive for years with permanent disability. This was understood by the chemists and military planners who developed and deployed these weapons. It was understood and accepted as a reasonable operational outcome. The soldiers who entered gas-affected areas, who lived and slept and ate in environments that retained traces of chemical agents in the soil and the mud and the material of their uniforms, normalized the experience of low-level chemical exposure, the way people in industrial cities had normalized the experience of breathing coal smoke. It was simply part of the environment. The gas masks that became standard equipment altered the way soldiers breathed, moved, communicated and perceived their surroundings. Wearing a gas mask during artillery bombardment, running in a gas mask, fighting in a gas mask, became routine behaviors that the military authorities drilled and evaluated. The human respiratory system, adapting to work inside a rubber and glass apparatus while chemical weapons drifted across the landscape, was not an extraordinary circumstance. It was Tuesday. The fifth practice was the systematic management of shell shock through denial. The phenomenon that we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was present from the very beginning of the war. Men who had survived artillery bombardments began presenting with symptoms that the medical authorities initially found inexplicable. They shook uncontrollably. They lost the ability to speak. They went blind without any physical damage to their eyes. They could not stop trembling. They woke screaming. They became unable to function in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. The initial medical response was to look for a physical explanation, hence the term shell shock. The theory being that the pressure waves from exploding shells had caused some kind of physical damage to the nervous system that was producing these symptoms. This theory was attractive to the military authorities because it implied a physical cause and potentially a physical cure. It was considerably less attractive than the alternative explanation, which was that men were breaking down psychologically under the sustained stress of industrialized warfare. Because that alternative explanation had implications that were very difficult to manage. If men were breaking down because the war itself was psychologically insupportable, that raised questions about the nature of the war that the military and political authorities were not prepared to answer. The official response was therefore a combination of things. Men who presented with obvious psychiatric symptoms were sometimes treated with genuine medical care. More often, they were returned to duty as quickly as possible, sometimes within days of presenting with severe dissociative symptoms, on the grounds that keeping men out of the line for psychiatric reasons set a precedent that could not be afforded. Men who appeared to be malingering, whose symptoms could not be attributed to any visible physical cause, were sometimes charged with cowardice. The distinction between cowardice and psychiatric collapse was never clearly defined in the regulations of any of the belligerent armies, and the application of that distinction was left to officers who were themselves under immense stress and who had strong institutional incentives to keep their units at fighting strength. The result was that men who were genuinely and severely psychologically damaged were returned to environments that were destroying them, and men who were judged to be malingering could face court-martial and, in some cases, execution. This was not exceptional, it was policy. The sixth practice was the routine execution of soldiers by their own side. Every major belligerent power in the First World War executed soldiers for military offenses, including desertion, cowardice in the face of the enemy, and mutiny. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during the war. France executed at least 600. The German Army executed several hundred. The Italian Army, under General Luigi Cadorna, maintained a policy of decimation in some units. The execution of one soldier in 10 chosen by lot when a unit was judged to have performed inadequately in battle. These executions were conducted by firing squad, in most cases at dawn, in front of assembled witnesses from the condemned man's own unit. The purpose of this practice was explicitly disciplinary. The theory was that men who might otherwise choose to run, or to fake incapacitation, or to avoid combat through any available means, would be deterred by the knowledge that their own side would kill them if they did so. This theory required a regular demonstration of that willingness. The executions therefore served a performative function. They were meant to be witnessed. They were meant to be remembered. The men who stood in the firing parties, who were ordered to aim and fire at a fellow soldier, a man they might have known, might have served alongside, were participating in a ritual designed to reinforce the authority of the state over the body of every individual in the unit. The fact that many of the men executed for cowardice were almost certainly suffering from psychiatric conditions that we would today recognize as disabling is not in dispute among historians. What is significant is that the institutional response to psychological breakdown included a formal mechanism for lethal punishment, and that this mechanism operated throughout the war as a normalized component of military justice. The seventh practice was the management of the front line as a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. In most previous major wars, armies had advanced, retreated, maneuvered. Positions had changed. The geography of the conflict had shifted over time. The Western Front of the First World War was, from roughly the end of 1914 to the spring of 1918, essentially static. The front lines ran from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a distance of approximately 700 kilometers, and they moved very little for most of the war. Men were rotated through the trenches on a cycle. They would spend time in the front line, then be rotated back to support trenches, then to reserve positions, then to rear areas for rest, before the cycle began again. The effect of this rotation was that the war ceased to be an event that happened and became an environment that one inhabited. Men did not go to battle. They went back to the line. The trench system itself became a kind of permanent geography with its own place names, its own landmarks, its own routines. Officers marked their maps with designations for trenches that had existed for months or years, that had been fought over and lost and retaken, that had accumulated layers of human occupation and human loss in their walls and their floors and their drainage systems. The men who lived in this geography developed adaptations to it. They learned the schedules of the enemy's artillery. They learned which sections of the line attracted more fire than others. They learned the specific sounds that distinguished incoming artillery from outgoing, the particular whistles and impacts that indicated distance and trajectory. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was survival knowledge, acquired by sustained exposure to an environment that was actively trying to kill them. And it became as automatic and unremarkable as any other form of environmental adaptation. A man who had been on the Western Front for 6 months knew things about the management of extreme danger that he had not known before and could not fully communicate after. He had developed reflexes, habits, and perceptions calibrated to an environment that did not exist anywhere else on Earth. And then, when the war ended, he was expected to transport himself back into civilian life and apply those calibrations to a world that bore no resemblance to the one in which they had been formed. The 8th practice was the normalization of rats, lice, and systematic bodily degradation as routine features of military life. The trenches of the Western Front were, from a sanitary standpoint, catastrophic. Men lived in proximity to the unrecovered dead. They lived in proximity to the waste products of thousands of human bodies in conditions where formal sanitation was impossible or inadequate. They lived in mud that was organically enriched with everything that had decomposed in it over months and years of fighting. The rats that inhabited the trench systems were not incidental. They were enormous, well-fed, and present in numbers that men described as almost incomprehensible. They fed on the unrecovered dead. They fed on the food stores of the living. They gnawed through equipment and supplies. They ran across sleeping men in the dark. The response to this was pragmatic. Men killed rats when they could, and endured them when they could not. Rat killing became a sport, a way of passing time, a competitive activity. The rats were not shocking. They were there. They were part of the environment. Lice were, if anything, a more pervasive presence. Almost every man on the Western Front had lice within weeks of entering the trenches. The lice lived in the seams of clothing, in the hair, in the skin. They caused constant irritation. They spread disease. They could not be permanently eliminated in field conditions, only temporarily reduced. The delousing stations behind the lines, where men's clothing was exposed to heat and steam to kill the lice, provided temporary relief that lasted until the next period in the trenches. Men spent time in any available moment picking lice from their clothing and from each other's hair, a practice that in any other context would be considered extreme evidence of squalor, but that in the context of the Western Front was simply hygiene. The language that soldiers used for this activity, the humor they applied to it, the casual matter-of-fact way in which they described it in letters home, subject always to the censor's review, reflects the degree to which this level of bodily degradation had been absorbed as normal. A man writing home to his wife in 1916 might mention the lice in the same sentence as the weather and the quality of the rations. It was that unremarkable. The 9th practice was the routine exposure of men to the decomposing dead as an environmental feature. The scale of casualties on the Western Front meant that significant numbers of the dead were never recovered. Artillery bombardments buried men. The no-man's land between opposing trenches was frequently impassable for recovery parties, who would themselves be killed attempting to bring in the wounded or the dead under fire. Men hung on the wire, in the open, in the mud, for days and weeks, and in some cases months. The smell of decomposition was a constant feature of the frontline environment, varying in intensity with temperature and wind, but never entirely absent in active sectors. Men who had been buried by shell blasts were sometimes partially uncovered by subsequent shell blasts, presenting fragments or features that had to be identified or left. The working parties that maintained and extended the trench systems regularly encountered the remains of men who had been buried months or years before by the movement of the earth under continuous bombardment. This exposure was not accidental. It was structural. The nature of the warfare made it impossible to maintain the kind of separation between the living and the dead that civilian culture, in all the involved societies, maintained as a basic feature of civilized life. Men ate meals within yards of decomposing bodies. Men slept in positions where the walls of their dugouts incorporated human remains. Men who developed what we might now recognize as complicated grief responses. Men who were unable to stop thinking about the dead lying unrecovered in no man's land, who were disturbed by the routine proximity to decomposition, were not particularly distinguished from those who seemed to manage the exposure without visible distress. The management of this exposure was not a formal part of military training, because acknowledging its psychological implications would have required acknowledging the nature of the environment in a way that the military authorities preferred not to do explicitly. Men were expected to adapt. Most did. The adaptation required is not a small or incidental thing. It is the restructuring of fundamental cognitive and emotional responses to the presence of death that takes years of civilian life to form and can apparently be altered by sustained exposure in a matter of weeks. The 10th practice was the development and systematic deployment of propaganda targeting the men's own populations. Every government engaged in the war understood from early on that the scale and duration of the conflict required the sustained consent of the civilian population in a way that previous wars had not. You could not raise and equip and sustain armies of millions for years without the cooperation of the civilian economy, and you could not maintain that cooperation without managing what the civilian population understood about the war and why it was being fought. The propaganda apparatus that all the involved nations developed during the First World War was not the improvised product of individual enthusiasm. It was institutional, funded, staffed by professionals, and coordinated across media in ways that were genuinely novel. Posters, newspapers, films, books, pamphlets, speeches, sermons, school curricula, all were mobilized to produce and maintain a specific narrative about the war. The British government established the War Propaganda Bureau, which recruited prominent writers and intellectuals to produce content supporting the war effort. Germany had its own apparatus. France had its own. The content produced by these organizations was not simply cheerleading. It was carefully calibrated to address the specific anxieties and motivations of the target audience. Recruitment posters were designed to activate shame in men who had not yet enlisted. Stories of enemy atrocities, some real and some fabricated or exaggerated, were circulated to maintain hatred of the enemy and commitment to the war. The image of the enemy was systematically dehumanized in ways that made the killing of enemy soldiers a morally simpler act than it might otherwise have been. What is significant about this practice, beyond its immediate effects, is what it established as normal. It established as normal the idea that a government has the right and the responsibility to actively manage what its citizens believe about a major national event. It established as normal the use of professional persuasion techniques, developed from commercial advertising and applied to political and military ends, to shape civilian attitudes. It established as normal the gap between official representation and actual reality that the soldiers knew and the civilians did not. The systems, the methods, the institutional infrastructure for mass persuasion that were developed and refined during the First World War did not disappear when the war ended. They were available, and they were used. The 11th practice was the treatment of mental illness in veterans as an administrative rather than a medical problem. The men who survived the war and returned home carrying visible or invisible psychological damage were processed through systems that were, by any reasonable standard, Inadequate. Physical wounds had a relatively clear pathway: field hospital, base hospital, transport home, treatment, discharge, or return to duty. Psychological wounds did not fit this pathway. The men who returned, with what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, with the dissociation, the nightmares, the inability to function in ordinary social settings, the hypervigilance, the emotional flatness that the war had produced, were entering a civilian medical system that had no established framework for understanding what they were experiencing and no standardized treatment for it. The pension systems of all the involved nations were designed primarily around physical disability. A man missing a limb had a clear, verifiable disability that could be assigned a percentage and compensated accordingly. A man who could not sleep, who could not work, who became paralyzed by the sound of a car backfiring, who could not sit in a room with his back to the door, presented an administrative challenge that the systems in place were not designed to resolve. Many veterans with severe psychological damage were judged capable of work and denied pensions. Many were processed through psychiatric facilities that had been developed for a different patient population and were not equipped to address the specific character of combat trauma. Many simply lived with their damage in private, in families and communities that had no language for what had happened to them and no institutional support for managing it. The normalization of untreated psychological injury in veterans of the First World War is not a minor footnote. It shaped the social history of the 1920s and 1930s in all the societies that had been involved in the war. The men who came back changed, who were difficult, who drank, who could not hold jobs, who were not the men their families had sent, were present in their millions across Europe and North America, and the systems designed to support them were not adequate to the scale of the problem. This was known. It was reported. Medical researchers and social workers and veterans organizations raised the alarm. The institutional response was insufficient, and the insufficiency was not accidental. Acknowledging the full scale of psychological damage caused by the war would have required acknowledging things about the nature of the war that the political structures that had managed it were not prepared to acknowledge. The 12th practice was the use of underage soldiers. The minimum age for military service in Britain was 19, and later 18 for overseas service. Despite this, an estimated 250,000 underage boys enlisted in the British Army alone during the war. Some were 16, some were younger. The recruitment system relied on the word of the recruiter and the word of the recruit, and both parties had reasons to overlook discrepancies. The recruiters were operating under pressure to fill quotas. The boys were often motivated by the same combination of patriotism and social pressure that motivated adult men, sometimes combined with a straightforward desire to escape the poverty and tedium of their civilian lives. The military authorities knew that underage soldiers were present in the ranks. This was not a secret. Boys who were discovered to be underage were sometimes returned home, sometimes not, depending on the circumstances and the timing. A boy who had been in France for a year and had demonstrated adequate performance was in many cases left where he was. A boy discovered at the point of enlistment might be turned away, but if he presented himself again in a few weeks with a slightly different story, the outcome might be different. The presence of boys under the legal age for service in the trenches of the Western Front, being shelled and gassed and required to go over the top in infantry assaults, was known, tolerated, and in some cases actively facilitated by the military bureaucracy. The boys who died in this way were processed through the same administrative machinery as the adult men. Their deaths were recorded with the same standardized language. Their families received the same telegrams. The fact that they were children, that their deaths represented a particular kind of institutional failure, was not a category that the administrative systems had been designed to recognize. The 13th practice was the normalization of alcohol as a management tool for combat stress. The rum ration was a formal institution in the British Army throughout the war. Men received a daily ration of rum, typically issued before going over the top, before particularly dangerous work, and in conditions of extreme cold or wet. The rum ration was not incidental to the management of the fighting force. It was a recognized instrument of military administration. The medical officers who supervised its distribution understood its physiological effects. The officers who requested additional rum allocations before major assaults understood what it was for. It was a tool for reducing the immediate physiological experience of extreme fear to a level compatible with forward movement. The fact that it worked was not disputed. The fact that it created, in men who had been receiving it for months or years, a significant physical and psychological dependence was also understood, but was not a primary concern of the military administration, whose time horizon was the duration of the war, rather than the subsequent decades in which the men would live with the consequences. The officers of other armies had their own versions of this. The German army issued alcohol. The French army's mutinies of 1917 were in part connected to the withdrawal of wine rations. Alcohol was not a side effect of the war. It was a component of its management, a recognized part of the toolkit for making men capable of doing things that they would not otherwise have been willing to do. And its integration into the daily routine of military life was so complete that the dependency it created in men who had been using it under extreme stress for years was simply transferred to civilian life along with everything else. The 14th practice was the systematic falsification of official records regarding conditions in the trenches and the true state of the army's morale. The censorship system that applied to letters home was comprehensive and, in its way, revealing. Letters written by soldiers were read by officers whose job it was to remove anything that contradicted the official narrative or that might be used by the enemy if intercepted. Soldiers knew this. They wrote with a kind of double consciousness, saying what was permissible and finding ways to communicate what was real through implication, through the things they didn't say, through private codes developed with their families that the censors did not understand. The official war diaries maintained by military units were also subject to a kind of institutional self-censorship. An officer writing a war diary knew that it would be read by his superiors. He knew the kind of narrative that was expected, accounts of confusion, of orders that made no tactical sense, of units that had been destroyed for no discernible military gain, of officers who had made catastrophic decisions, were not the kind of entries that advanced a career. The result was a body of official documentation that was, in many respects, a systematically distorted account of events. The truth of what had happened on any given day in any given sector of the front existed in a complicated relationship with the official record of what had happened. Historians who have worked with these documents understand this. They know to look for the places where the official account becomes vague, where the casualties reported seem inconsistent with the operations described, where the language shifts from specific to general in ways that suggest something is being omitted. The production of official records that systematically misrepresented events was not the work of dishonest individuals. It was the product of institutional incentives that rewarded certain kinds of reporting and penalized others, operating across thousands of officers over 4 years until the archive of the war was an accumulation of strategically managed truths that required significant interpretive work to decode. The 15th practice was the industrialization of burial and the treatment of the dead as a logistical problem. The Graves Registration Commission was established by the British Army in 1915 to manage the identification, burial, and recording of the dead. The scale of the task was without precedent. At the peak of major offensives, the dead were so numerous and so widely distributed that systematic burial became impossible. Bodies were gathered and interred wherever possible, often in improvised cemeteries close to the front, often without full identification, often in mass graves. The graves were marked when possible with wooden crosses, recorded in registers, mapped. When the ground over which the fighting moved changed hands, the graves changed hands with it. British graves in areas captured by the Germans were sometimes destroyed, sometimes preserved. German graves in areas retaken by the British were sometimes destroyed, sometimes preserved. After the war, the Imperial War Graves Commission undertook the enormous task of locating, identifying where possible, and permanently commemorating the British and Commonwealth dead. The result was the cemetery system that still exists across northern France and Belgium. The rows of identical white headstones, the walls engraved with the names of those whose bodies were never found or never identified. The uniformity of these cemeteries is often described as democratic, the idea that the gravestone of a private is identical to that of a general, that rank is abolished in death. This reading is not wrong, but the uniformity also reflects something else. It reflects the impossibility of individual commemoration at the scale of the losses. It reflects the administrative solution to the problem of acknowledging losses so large that any attempt to treat each one individually would have overwhelmed the systems available. The cemetery is a beautiful and moving thing. It is also a logistics solution. The 16th practice was the use of new medical procedures on a scale that converted experimental treatments into standard protocols. The First World War drove advances in surgery, in the treatment of infection, in the management of shock, in the reconstruction of damaged faces and bodies that had no peacetime equivalent. Harold Gillies, a New Zealand-born surgeon working in Britain, developed the techniques of plastic and reconstructive surgery in large part because of the sheer number of men arriving at his ward with faces destroyed by artillery fragments, machine gun fire, and gas. The men who passed through his ward at Sidcup were not medical curiosities. They were, in a very precise sense, the raw material from which modern reconstructive surgery was developed. The techniques that Gillies and his colleagues invented and refined were invented and refined on men who had been catastrophically injured in a war. The scientific knowledge that emerged from this, the ability to rebuild damaged faces, to graft skin, to reshape bone, is real and valuable, and has benefited millions of people in the centuries since. The circumstances of its creation are inseparable from that value. The industrial production of a specific category of catastrophic facial injury by weapons designed and deployed by governments created the clinical conditions under which a new field of medicine could be developed. The same logic applies across multiple fields. The management of infectious disease in the trenches, the treatment of gas casualties, the orthopedic surgery required for the particular types of fractures produced by high explosive shells, all produced advances in medical knowledge that were made possible by the sustained, high-volume production of human injury. The medical establishment understood this. The benefits that accrued to post-war medicine from wartime experience were acknowledged and valued. This is not a comfortable thing to hold alongside the source of that experience, but it is accurate. The 17th practice was the management of mutinies and mass refusals through institutional silence. The French army mutinies of 1917 are the most extensively documented example, but they are not unique. After the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive in the spring of 1917, in which French forces suffered enormous casualties in an assault that had been promised to break the German lines definitively and failed to do so, a significant portion of the French army refused to continue offensive operations. The scale of the refusal was significant. Estimates suggest that at one point units covering approximately half the Western Front were affected by some degree of collective insubordination, ranging from outright refusal to attack to more passive forms of resistance. The French military authorities, under General Philippe Pétain, who replaced Nivelle as commander-in-chief, managed the situation through a combination of concession and targeted punishment. Conditions were improved. Leave was extended. The most egregious proponents of suicidal tactics were quietly set aside, and approximately 554 men were sentenced to death, of whom 49 were actually executed. The mutinies were suppressed by adjusting the ratio of concession to punishment in a way that made continued resistance seem pointless. They were also suppressed by the most comprehensive censorship operation of the entire war. The French authorities were so successful at preventing any public knowledge of the mutinies that the British High Command, despite operating adjacent French forces, had only fragmentary and incomplete information about what had occurred. The German army, whose intelligence services were monitoring French communications, had considerably more information, and one of the enduring historical questions is why they did not exploit the knowledge. The mutinies were kept secret, not just from the German enemy, but from the French public, from the British ally, from posterity as far as the French authorities could arrange it. The secret held, essentially, until the 1960s. The 18th practice was the development of the convoy system and submarine warfare as competing methods of industrialized maritime killing. The German decision to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare, announced in early 1917, was in operational terms a logical extension of the blockade strategy that both sides had been employing. The German Navy concluded that if it could sink enough Allied merchant shipping to disrupt the flow of supplies to Britain, it could force a settlement before American entry into the war could materially affect the balance of power. The calculation was precise and cold. The German naval staff estimated the tonnage of shipping that needed to be sunk per month to achieve a given level of disruption. They estimated the number of submarines required to achieve that tonnage. They estimated the likely losses to their submarine fleet. They did not significantly factor into their calculations the human lives that would be lost with the ships they were sinking, because the men on those ships were not a variable in the equation they were solving. The Allied response, the convoy system, and the intensification of anti-submarine warfare was similarly calculated. The question of how many merchant sailors could be lost while the system of supply was maintained was a logistics question. The men on the merchant ships, who were not military personnel, who had not been drafted or formally enlisted, who were operating vessels carrying food and ammunition and raw materials, were dying in the cold water of the North Atlantic and the North Sea in numbers that were tracked on charts and entered in tables and assessed in terms of their operational significance. The civilian maritime workers who died in the submarine campaigns of the First World War have no memorial equivalent to the military cemeteries that commemorate the soldiers. Their deaths were a cost of doing business, in the most literal sense, and they were managed accordingly. The 19th practice was the transfer of military organizational techniques to the management of civilian economies. The First World War required all the involved governments to take control of their national economies in ways that had no peacetime precedent. The British government introduced rationing, took control of the railways, directed industrial production, regulated wages and prices, managed the allocation of labor across sectors, and generally operated the national economy as a centrally directed system rather than a market. Germany went further and earlier, developing the Kriegswirtschaft, the war economy, under the direction of Walter Rathenau, who organized the allocation of raw materials and industrial production with a systematic efficiency that was studied and admired by observers across the political spectrum. The techniques that were developed for managing national economies during the war, the statistical methods, the planning frameworks, the regulatory instruments, the institutional structures for directing resource allocation, did not disappear when the war ended. They remained available as tools, as precedents, as evidence that centralized direction of economic activity at the national scale was possible and effective. The political implications of this legacy were worked out across the following decades in ways that had consequences well beyond the war itself. The 20th practice was the systematic exposure of soldiers to cold, wet, and physically degenerative conditions that produced a category of injury specific to the trench environment. Trench foot was a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions in which blood circulation to the feet was impaired. In severe cases, it led to gangrene and amputation. In the early months of the war, before the problem was fully recognized and managed, trench foot was epidemic in the British forces. The military response was characteristically administrative. Foot inspection protocols were introduced. Men were required to change socks at specified intervals. Officers were made responsible for the foot condition of their men, and failure to maintain adequate foot care in a unit was a potentially career-affecting failure for the relevant officer. This turned the management of a physiological consequence of the conditions in which men were being held into a matter of individual disciplinary responsibility, which is a very particular kind of institutional response. It acknowledged that the conditions were causing a specific injury. It did not change the conditions. It imposed a system of individual accountability for managing the consequences of those conditions, which had the effect of making the soldier himself and his immediate officers responsible for an injury that was a direct product of a policy decision made far above their level. This pattern, the creation of individual responsibility for the management of systemic harms, runs through many of the institutional practices of the war. The conditions that produced the harm were determined by forces that the individual had no power to change. The consequences of that harm were managed through systems that placed responsibility for them as close to the individual as possible. The 21st practice, the one that perhaps most clearly encapsulates the transformation that the war wrought on the relationship between states and the bodies of their citizens, was the development and institutionalization of the medical board as the instrument through which a man's body was assessed, categorized, and directed. The medical board was not a treatment facility. It was a classification system. Men presenting themselves for military service were examined by military doctors who assessed their physical condition according to a standardized grading system and assigned them to categories that determined where they would go and what they would do. Men already in service who had been wounded or who had fallen ill were assessed by similar boards to determine whether they were fit to return to duty, fit for light duty, fit only for service away from the front, or permanently unfit. The language of these assessments was the language of resource management. A man was assessed in terms of his utility to the military machine. His body was evaluated not as the container of a particular human life with its own intrinsic value, but as a unit of military potential that could be assessed on a standardized scale and allocated accordingly. Men who objected to their categorization, who felt that they were being returned to duty in a condition that made that duty likely to kill them, had recourse to a formal appeals process that was itself managed by the same institutional framework that had made the initial decision. The medical boards processed millions of men during the course of the war. They created a precedent for the systematic medical evaluation of individuals for state purposes that extended well beyond the war into the management of civilian insurance systems, welfare systems, and employment systems in the following decades. The idea that a qualified professional could assess a human body against a standardized scale and assign it a categorical designation that determined what the state would provide to it or require of it did not originate with the First World War. But the First World War conducted this practice at a scale and with an institutional thoroughness that established it as a normal feature of the relationship between the modern state and the individual body. When the war ended on November 11, 1918, the guns stopped at 11 in the morning, and the silence was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Men who had lived with continuous artillery for months stood in the sudden quiet and did not know what to do with it. The armistice did not end the war's consequences. The influenza pandemic that had been moving through the military populations of all the involved nations for months continued into the civilian populations of the world, killing somewhere between 50 and 100 million people over the following 2 years, a figure that exceeded the military deaths of the war itself. The peace settlements that followed the armistice, primarily the Treaty of Versailles signed in June 1919, imposed terms on Germany that the German population experienced as humiliating and unjust. The reparations required, the territorial losses imposed, the clause assigning Germany sole responsibility for the war created grievances that were political fuel for the following 2 decades. The men who came home from the war came home into economies disrupted by the transition from war production to peace, into societies that had been permanently altered by 4 years of mass mobilization, into families that had lost members, and in many cases entire structures of social and economic support. The disabled veterans who required ongoing medical care, the widows and orphans who required support, the men who could work but only in limited capacities, placed demands on the state welfare systems of all the involved countries that those systems were not designed or funded to meet. The political consequences of this insufficiency were significant in every involved nation, but nowhere more consequential than in Germany, where the combination of military defeat, punitive peace terms, economic disruption, and the psychological and social legacy of the war created the conditions in which the political forces that would produce the next war were able to grow. The total military dead of the First World War are estimated at approximately 10 million. The total civilian dead, from direct violence, from disease, from famine caused by blockades and disruption of food systems, are estimated at a further 7 million. The total casualties, including the wounded, the prisoners, and the missing, run to numbers so large that they strain the capacity of ordinary human comprehension. The war left approximately 21 million wounded soldiers. It left behind an unknown number of men with permanent psychological damage that was never formally treated or recorded. It left behind a generation of women in Britain, France, Germany, and across the continent who had lost the men they might have married, who lived out their lives in a demographic imbalance that the war had created and that no policy could repair. It left behind the physical landscape of northern France and Belgium, so comprehensively altered by artillery and mining that significant portions of it are still, more than a century later, unsuitable for agriculture because of the unexploded ordnance that remains in the soil. The iron harvest, as it is called, the annual turning up of shells and grenades and gas canisters by plows and construction equipment in the former battle zones, continues to produce casualties in the present day. The war did not end. It changed form. It became the ground that the following century was built on. It became the administrative precedents, the medical practices, the propaganda techniques, the weapons technologies, the international law frameworks, the psychological categories, the organizational methods, the ways of thinking about the relationship between states and individuals, and the acceptable cost of human life that shaped everything that came after it. The 21 disturbing practices described here were not aberrations in the war's history. They were the war. They were the rational, organized, institutionally sanctioned responses of modern bureaucratic states to the demands of industrial-scale military conflict. They were the everyday life of approximately 65 million men in uniform across 4 years of sustained fighting. And when the war ended, the men who had lived that life, and the institutions that had organized it, and the societies that had supported it, and the governments that had directed it, carried the knowledge of how it worked into the world that came after, where it waited, embedded in procedure and precedent, and the practiced indifference of administrative systems to the human cost of their operations, for the next occasion on which it would be needed.